we have in those middens, in the Native American middens, we have a lot of sea otter bones. So sea otters were very abundant in the bay. Sea otters, whales, just imagine. It was a lively place, shall we say.
It's almost sterile now.
Yeah. So, and the migratory waterfowl, this interface between uplands and the bay was very much more complex than today. We had these very sinuous, channels which brought fresh water down, salt water in. There were a lot of different processes. You had in storms, you would have these floods that would send out sediment onto the marsh plain, and that would then be colonized by the marsh. So it was really, really complex, much more so than today. And this is true for just about all the tidal wetlands around the world, but there is this gradient that goes from deep, subtidal, to, in our case, the low marsh. We have eelgrass and oysters in this area that's kind of low in the tidal frame. Cordgrass is our low marsh. Pickleweed tends to be our high marsh in the salt marsh area anyway. And then you have these transition zones between the uplands and the marsh. So there's a lot of diversity that existed that in many cases just doesn't exist anymore because these areas have been diked, and these areas have been damaged by a combination of things, including too much sediment coming down that probably helped to knock out a lot of the eelgrass beds and things like that. That was during the hydraulic mining era. So there's been a lot of change, and this kind of documents. So this is generally the areas of the marshes and the mud flats that historically existed in this part of the estuary we call the bay. So things started changing in 1769 when it was discovered. The early colonization brought huge numbers of cattle. They were basically a cattle economy. Hides were a big part of how they made a living. So then later on in 1849 they discovered gold, and within the mid 1800s they discovered hydraulic mining and washed away huge banks with gold, and all that sediment came down through the system, through the rivers, into the delta and down out through the bay, and caused big buildups of sediment in the mud flats, say for example San Pablo Bay. And then these flumes a huge number of flumes were built to support this hydraulic mining, which then eventually turned into dams. You move the water around, and we have dams, and we had dredging. We had, for a long time, places like the Sassoon really relied on boats coming up, and we didn't have railroads. And eventually this turned into a massive water delivery system, including all these dams in the Sierra. We filled a huge portion of the bay. Some of the areas like the Sassoon started out as agricultural, but eventually just became private duck clubs. And we started doing salt ponds down in the South Bay. If you consider the bay and baylands, the footprint of the baylands, we've lost about a third of the bay to the loss of the wetlands in particular, but other parts of the bay as well. So it's shrunk significantly. So this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea, just to sum up. And it's kind of important to think about this. I like this slide only because it says back in the day of the Miwok and the Ohlone, they basically would set up their homes along or near the bay, where they would spend part of the year on harvesting the resources near the tidelands, and then say probably in the spring, summer, they would move upland and to harvest. They would hunt deer and things of that nature. They had other ways of making a living. And the bottom line is that as the sea level would rise and push inland, they could relocate their villages without too much problem. When we built these, it became a problem. We've managed to burn down this probably a few times, but by the time we get to this situation where we are today, there really isn't a lot of forgiveness in the footprint of our urban environment now. It's kind of like we've forged a bathtub ring around the bay, and we didn't think about it at the time. Why would you? But now that we are thinking about climate change and sea level rise and rapid sea level rise, we realize there are a lot of parts of this area now that are extremely vulnerable to flooding and other kinds of conditions along those lines.
When you said a third of the bay has been
yeah, it's a footprint. It's a footprint. So if you include the tide lands.
Including the marshes.
Yeah. Those areas, like, if you could envision, what's the extent of the bay in the high tides of the year? It would have pushed down through those marshes and covered the marshes with water. So that's the perimeter we're talking about. But you hear that frequently, and it's kind of good to realize that we're talking not just about the shoreline per se, because the low tide shoreline is different than the high tide shoreline. It's the high tide shoreline. The bay. So, yes, question.
Wasn't there something done to the bay, like back when you were saying that they would infill the bay with sand? Wasn't there one point where they were going to turn the San Francisco Bay into just the river? And I was looking for pictures online to kind of show, like you had your previous slide showed just the kind of dark blue, and then it showed the light blue, the tidal areas.
Yeah.
Was there talk of making San Francisco Bay very small? And there was a group of women that stopped it or something?
Yeah, no, that was, there was actually discussion of damming the mouth of the bay at the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yes, okay.
And they wanted to put a series of dams to control flows, essentially. And and then there was and that was Save the Bay. You're talking about Save the Bay and the 3 Florence La Riviera and
right.
They really got going when there was a threat to basically take off the top of San Bruno Mountain and use it to fill the bay. They're going to create gigantic conveyor belts, and that was it. Then they said, this has gone too far. We're just doing too much filling the bay. So these 3 women managed to get the ear of a lot of politicians, and eventually the McAteer-Petrus Act was passed, which created the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. And then not too long thereafter, in the early 1970s, that's when the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act was passed, which incorporated BCDC, but also created the Coastal Commission.
Yes.
So we have two coastal zone managers in California now, the outer coast and the bay. And the bay shoreline is not quite, but approximately the same length of the shoreline of California from the north to the south. I mean, it's a big, there's a lot of area. So anyway, that's just an interesting tidbit.
At the end of your presentation, could you help me find pictures of what the bay would have looked like had that organization not done anything?
Well, I don't know. I've been showing you some, and I would be happy to share these with you. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah. Okay.
Well, San Francisco was a marsh, mud flats. There was a big bay called Mission Bay. It was actually, because it was tideland, there's a really interesting book. If you ever want to get a great book, it's by Matthew Booker, and it's called Down by the Bay. And the first chapter in that book talks about San Francisco and what happened in San Francisco. San Francisco...
Down by the Bay.
Yeah, Down by the Bay by Matthew Booker. Great book, great book. Anyway, I'm going to keep rolling here.
Sure.
So it began to dawn on people that things were not going so hot for the Bay. And they started this project over about 1988 to 1992 or 3 or something like that. And it resulted in, and this was the EPA, and they declared the Bay an estuary project, and they came out with this report in 1993, the Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan, and they recognized basically that there were real serious problems with fish in the Bay, and particularly some of the local endemic fish like the Delta smelt. They realized that all this diversion of the water had created, during drought time, water agencies commit water. They deliver it even when there's a drought. So what's left over goes down and supports the fish. So this just shows this correlation between the decline of the Delta smelt, which is still basically just barely hanging on, and the water diversions. And then another study demonstrated that the historic bay was highly fragmented and wetlands had been lost. So in the delta, which is here, it's over 95% of the tidal wetlands were lost. I mean, it's like there's so little of it left, but there are little edges of riparian and some little islands, that didn't get diked off. So it's amazing. In this part, I call that the delta, and this part we call the bay, and it really goes from Sassoon Bay on down through the South Bay, and it kind of cuts off here at the Golden Gate. So when we're talking about the bay, we're talking about this area, okay? And you can just see here that there's still a huge amount of wetland loss, and more important in some ways, but certainly for certain kinds of species, is this fragmentation. When you fragment a system like this into little small pieces, populations of species that depend on that habitat become isolated. There's only so much, they can only carry so many individuals, and they start inbreeding, and it sets the stage for an extinction event. So when the Endangered Species Act was passed in the early 1970s, it was recognized that there were certain species like the clapper rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse that had clearly been negatively impacted by the loss of habitat and fragmentation of habitat, and they were listed as endangered. That listing of these species has had a big effect on the bay. We'll talk about that in a moment, maybe.
Thank you.
It's on. Just pull up a chair as close as you can. It's highly informal. So that impact on the tidal wetlands was what caused a group of scientists and an organization called the San Francisco Estuary Institute in particular to start to talk about, okay, it's clear that we need to restore tidal wetlands so that we can save these species and so that we can bring back this ecosystem, which, as it turns out, has tremendous, important services for the bay, such as detoxifying heavy metals and things of that nature. The marshes are great at doing that. These marsh muds, they're anoxic. Providing habitat for all these kinds of species, providing buffer to the shoreline. So these are living shorelines which buffer wave action and erosion. So there are all these different kinds of ecosystem services, as they're called, that were lost as a result of the marshes being lost. Including another one is marshes, as I just mentioned earlier. Hi, your name is?
Mike?
Hi, Mike. Oh, God, we got 3 mics. We got 2 mics. It's plenty loud here, thankfully. No, anyway, great to have you here, Mike. Anyway, so I mentioned early on, and we'll get back to this, about how marshes are really kind of created by an equilibrium almost between the amount of sediment that comes in, the sea level at the time, and that kind of creates the opportunity for these marsh plants to exist in this particular. And some like it higher, like the pickleweed, some like it lower, like the cordgrass. They sort themselves out on the basis of these factors. And I don't know why I got off on that topic. Let's see here. Well, in any case, with all the loss, with all the loss of the wetlands, 80% of the wetlands in the bay, there was no filter mechanism for all that sediment anymore. Sediment washes in, sediment washes out. Sediment starts filling everything, fills the channels. Now we have to dredge in order just to move a boat up into a marina. And you can look around the bay now and the same phenomenon is happening. We just don't have enough marshes to sort of capture that sediment, so the channels fill up with sediment. Okay, so that's another, I'm just talking about ecosystem services. So there was an effort to say, okay, what do we do about this situation? Where do we put more marshes? Where do we restore marshes? How much restoration do we really need? And to be perfectly honest, somebody went like this. Okay, we had 200,000 acres of marshes in the bay, and we need at least 100,000 acres to get sort of back to where we were before. So this became the target, 100,000 acres. We were down to 40,000 acres of different, a few little tidbits remaining. If you add them up, it was about 40,000. We realized then, therefore, we needed another 60,000 acres to be restored in order to bring us up to that 100,000. That's a lot of marsh, by the way. That's a lot of tidal wetland. A lot of places around the country, most places around the country that have tidal wetlands don't have our problem. They didn't have these massive losses of tidal wetlands, but we did. So anyway, so this was the 1999 goals report, and it set the target of 60,000 acres of restored wetlands to bring us up to 100,000. That would be approximately half of what we had historically. So the personal part of the story is back in the early 1990s, 1990, I started working for San Francisco State. I was the coordinator for the conservation biology program. I became a lecturer, and I got picked on by the dean to start this project to try to come up with a design for a reserve, because he really wanted to see it augment our new marine biology facility, which is the Romberg Tiburon Center in Tiburon. And that's basically where we're headquartered today. History matters. In any case, so we joined all these other reserves, 29 reserves around the country. Just out of curiosity, how many people here have ever heard of the National Estuarine Research Reserve before you read this thing tonight? How many people ever heard of the San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, or even the National Estuarine Research Reserve program in general? You did. Great.
I did from the Exploratorium.
Okay, great. Oh,
It's the
cool.
Marine Mammal Center.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, it's one of the better guarded secrets in the bay.
Yeah.
And in any case, so I got started on this back then, and we started coming up with a design. First of all, we decided what we really need is to learn about the remnant marshes that are left, protect them, and apply that knowledge to the whole restoration enterprise. What can we learn from our existing? So what are the targets for the restorations and things like that? We want to know the species, how the
There was no rain change.
exactly. So that was the idea, and we selected 8 places in the estuary that had that these are great spots. Okay, China Camp and Rush Ranch, and then Petaluma Marsh, the largest salt marsh in the estuary. This is a great little remnant marsh here at Corte Madera. There's some not very slim pickings in the South Bay, but this little area of Bear and Greco Island came up. And right here at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin was Browns Island, a wonderful place. And we had a couple of smaller remnant marshes here in the Sassoon, but the big daddy was Rush Ranch, that 1,000-acre parcel of tidal wetland. So this was our target. We wanted to have these inform future restoration. We knew that we needed to have geographical representation because up here it's fresh, here it's kind of brackish, here it's subsaline, here it's hypersaline. So we knew that we had really different hydrologies in these systems, different tidal ranges, different species. So we wanted to have...
Is there another nerve like that with such a diversity of salinity and hydrology?
The Virginia NER tries to do the same thing. And they do that on one of the sub-watersheds, the York River in Chesapeake Bay. But not too many other ones so we were a little bit unusual in that regard. This was our target. And so we started to talk to the agencies that own these sites, and over time, the first one to pull out was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They said, "No, we got plans." They didn't really tell us why they didn't want to do it. Then a whole batch of them were the California Fish and Wildlife sites. So some of the best sites, like the Petaluma Marsh, disappeared when they pulled out. And that was after so this is like 6 years later, as I've been working on this project. The dean's kind of looking at me like, "You're not doing very well." But I said, no, just wait a minute. This one is a great nurse site. I'd been to a lot of the nurse sites, and I knew it had the right kind of infrastructure, fabulous place, willing partner. Bingo. Same with the Rush Ranch. Solana Land Trust was a great partner. They had facilities. Like a lot of places like Petaluma Marsh did not have any facilities. So it was like a perfect kind of place, because the research reserve is more than research actually. It's much more like monitoring, education, training, stewardship, all those kinds of things. Requires access. The one that got away was Browns Island. What happened with Browns Island? Well, East Bay Parks was really excited about having Browns Island come into the reserve. And we would at least had fresh, brackish, salt, cool. But Richard Pombo, anybody remember Richard Pombo? He was the chair of the natural resources in the House during, I think it was the Bush administration, George W. Anyway, it scuttled it. He just basically did not. The Port of Stockton had a tiny, like a little in-holding in this they'll never use in a million years, and it became political, and so it got pulled. So we ended up with China Camp and Rush Ranch, and we did, in fact, establish our headquarters at the EOS Center. I wasn't sure why we were doing that, but as it turned out, it's been a fantastic way for us to engage graduate students, faculty, researchers, and we get a lot of advantages by having our headquarters there, and we work really well, with our partners. So it's just actually turned out incredibly well, and we did capture 2 of the absolute most wonderful sites for tidal wetlands in the estuary. Yep. Huh? Yeah.
Field trip.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, field trip is coming up. Yeah. So so here's what it looked like when that first report for the Bay Habitat Goals that was published in 1999. And then this is what it looks like in 2015. I'm going to get into this. So by this time, we were actively restoring or had plans or had secured the properties and were moving towards restoring about 30,000 acres. So we're half our goal by 2015. But in terms of monitoring, and I should have mentioned this, one of the key things that we felt about the original design was that we would monitor those different parts so that we could understand changes to the system and relate those to the projects. We felt that it was vital that we take a regional approach, not just a project by project approach. But actually during this entire time, it was all project by project monitoring, all funded by the project proponents. The data that was collected sent to the, nothing, no aspersions intended, but to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, to BCDC, to Army Corps, and essentially these reports go in and they never come out. Nobody ever analyzes them, and if you tried to analyze them, you'd have a heck of a time trying to make the data relate to one another because there's no protocols to make the data compatible to analysis. So essentially, almost 20 years, 17 years, whatever, of just, oh, did you do what you, yeah, you said you, well, yeah, and no understanding, no lessons learned out of this process. And some academics did some work on it, some consultants did some publications, but few and far between, and nothing really big and regional in scope. Yep, you got it. So one of the, kind of an interesting example of this is the South Bay Salt Ponds. It's a huge project, millions of dollars. And they grounded their whole program with the idea of adaptive management, and they got us really neat adaptive management program going, but it's expensive, and it only applied to their sites. It didn't apply to all the other sites in the bay. So they were, even though there was really, it was kind of exemplary in a way, a couple of things happened really. They were only able to really work their particular place in the estuary, and they began to run out of money. They began to run out of funding. And they haven't run out of funding, but they've largely run out of funding. So it wasn't sustainable. That's the bottom line. All right, so I'm getting there. Whoops.
I'm sorry, Mike, I thought this went till 6, so I'm gonna have to.
You gotta go, I understand. And I knew that it was only gonna go to 6, we got a little bit of a late start.
I know she'll catch me up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So listen, let me get out of your way.
Have it.
And anybody else who wants to get moving
That's
is
from
okay
your,
with me, and I'll keep
your
talking.
ride.
Oh, it's my death
I'm gonna kind of
Yeah, you want to keep that. I mean, I'll wash it for you and give it back.
watch for this. This is gonna, watch out for that cord there.
Oops, we.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, nice meeting you. All right,
Nice to meet you.
all right, take care.
Bye.